Okay, there we go. Well, hello, Ali. Thank you so much for joining us. Really excited to be able to speak with you today. And Barrett and I have a few questions that we've prepared for you, and I think we'll just be switching off asking the questions. And let us know if you have any other questions along the way. So our first question is, what inspired you to run for office, and what is the issue that is the most important to you to solve?
Oh, excellent. Well, that's a great question. First, I want to thank you and the Democratic Youth Coalition for inviting me. I'm excited for this opportunity. Um, so, what inspired me to run? And I think what inspired me to run originally was my son. He was the one who encouraged me to run. Um, what motivated me to run was being unhappy with how things were working in this district, right? So, um, there was a lot going on in the summer of 2020 with COVID and Black Lives Matter and the growing economic inequalities. And there was a growing sense of we really need someone watching out for us. And I really felt that our representative was not doing that. A lot of times he was saying the right thing, but then he would vote differently. And then the moment for me when I decided to run was uh, watching the news. I've told this story a couple times. I was watching the news, and they had just finished going on about COVID and people losing their jobs, losing their health care because they were tied to the jobs, people at risk of losing their homes. They just shown a bunch of folks waiting in food lines. And then the next story was Jerry Connolly had held up the HEROES Act, which, if you'll recall, was the funding that was supposed to help the first COVID relief bill. And he held it up so he could put several $billions in funding to support the military industrial complex, government contractors, so they could pay for headquarters and whatnot. And for me, that was the moment. That was the moment that sparked my outrage and decided me that I needed to embark on this journey. Does that answer your question?
Thank you. And if elected, what would you like to accomplish in your first 100 days in office?
Oh, excellent. Well, the first day in office, what I intend to do is introduce something we're currently calling the Conflict of Interest Act. So one of the biggest problems that I see is corporate influence in government and how that skews all the other things we're trying to do, right? So my goal is to introduce legislation that would require congressmen and women to recuse themselves from voting on any piece of legislation that would impact a corporation from which they receive campaign contributions. So what that means, for example, is let's say there's a piece of legislation that would affect telecommunications. Well, if somebody's getting money from, say, AT&T or whatever, they would not be able to vote on that piece of legislation. They would have to recuse themselves. And that would also necessitate making it a requirement that all Congress people, that they reveal their sources of corporate contributions, right? Like, I'm not taking any corporate PAC or dark money, but a lot of Congress people take corporate money, and they take a lot of dark money. And dark money is when political action campaigns, PACs, they bundle third-party funds and then provide it to a congressperson. And you don't know where that money comes from or who's in it, right? And so you'd have to reveal who's giving you the money. And then the third tenet of that act that I'd like to put in is it would prohibit congressmen and women, once they leave office, from going to work for those corporations for at least a decade. Because right now there's this revolving thing, right? Like Congress gets lobbied by these corporations to pass all this legislation, and they get all this funding. And then when the congressperson leaves office, they get a cushy job with that corporation. It's almost like a quid pro quo in some instances. And so that would be the absolute first thing I would do. And then in terms of 100 days, I think once you remove that corporate influence, which is skewing things, and you take out the the incentive to serve those corporate interests, you're going to see all this legislation that so many of us want, right? So for example, universal health care. If you have people who are getting a lot of money from the healthcare industry or big pharma, they have zero incentive for wanting universal health care, right? Even though it's going to save 68,000 lives every year and $450 billion a year, it's a no-brainer if your true interest is serving the people of this country and not corporate interests. So if the people who are getting that money from the healthcare industry can't vote on it, then those of us who are not getting money and just truly want to help people can pass those things. And that's true for, you know, name your piece of legislation, right? That's true for everything across the board. And so that would be what I would like to do my first 100 days.
Great, that's really interesting to hear. And in terms of the conflict of interest policy, can you tell us more about your motivation for implementing this policy and also just more about the bill in general?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what it comes down to is that, you know, there's a lot of talk about wanting campaign finance reform and all this other stuff. And there is zero incentive to reform how we finance campaigns and how we finance elected officials, because right now there's too many people making too much profit. So for example, Jerry Connolly, the person I'm running against, he gets 90% of his funding from corporate PACs and dark money. 90%. Why would he want to change that? But if we said, you know what, you now have to reveal who is exactly is giving you all your money, and you can no longer vote on any piece of legislation that's going to impact those corporate donors, that's going to be a big incentive for him and most other members of Congress who are taking corporate money to either stop taking it or to, you know, stop voting.
And could you go into more detail about the aspects of your background and lived experience that you will have that can be an effective civil servant?
Sure, you're kind of breaking up a little bit. Can you repeat that?
Yeah. Could you go into detail about the aspects of your background and lived experiences that will help you as an effective civil servant?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So I've got a master's in public policy with an environmental law and economics track from Georgetown. And I spent 30 years working as an environmental professional. I started in a nonprofit foundation and I worked my way up so that I actually served as the program manager for the Department of Defense's Natural Resources Program. The vast majority of my experience and expertise has been in natural resources program management and policy making. So, for example, threatened, endangered, and at-risk species, invasive species, migratory birds, pollinators, amphibians, and reptiles, and of course, climate change. And I actually helped draft the language that is currently in the Department of Defense natural resource instruction that enables our land managers to consider climate impacts for every natural resource decision they make. So anytime they want to do something, they have to look at the impacts from climate change. And we actually developed a stepwise guide for how to do that. And I did most of these things not alone in a vacuum, but working in partnership. So I'm big on working collaboratively, because everything in nature and most things in life are not, they're not easy. They're complex and they require consideration, and they require multiple points of view so that you can get to a good point. So for example, with the climate guidance, we reached out to land managers, we reached out to headquarters staff who are responsible for policy making and for managing budgets across pillar areas, and we reached to technical experts. We did keep the group relatively small. We brought them together, and through an iterative process, we came out with a step-by-step guide for how to do this that is being used and was very well received because we took the time to do it right, if that makes sense.
Yes.
And other things, for example, with so I actually was involved in my early years in helping set up programs that were both national and international in scope, where we worked with local groups like local Audubon groups, local land conservancies, as well as the various states, regions, foreign governments, et cetera, for example, to set up an initiative called Partners in Flight, which is geared towards stemming the decline of migratory birds across the Western Hemisphere, all the way from Alaska down to the southern tip of South America. So, and I can talk more about various experience. I've got 30 years, so I've been involved in a lot of things, and feel, what's interesting that you ask this. There's not currently a single member of Congress who has any environmental management or policy experience. So if elected, I actually would be the only one in Congress to have that, which is crucial given where we are with climate change, and given this really short-sighted view to take an incremental approach. So I think that mine would be a voice that would be impactful and worthwhile.
Great. And as a follow-up question, what are some environmental actions you wish to see implemented?
I would like to see aggressive climate action through implementation of methane reduction, because methane currently has anywhere, depends on your time horizon, right? So it can currently have a 30-fold more significant impact than carbon in global warming. If it's a 20-year, it's like 80 something fold, like 80 times more, right? And I would like to see, so I'd like to see some serious action on methane, and we can make a really big difference with existing technologies, but it'd be great to see new technologies. I'd like to see us really make a difference in reducing our carbon footprints and reducing acidification of the oceans. And we need to, if you look at the Green New Deal, it's ultimately, it's a jobs program. It's a federal jobs guarantee, right? And if we are able to transition folks through training and creation of these opportunities into more sustainable futures, I think that that's going to benefit everybody. And the weird thing is, like, there's a lot of misinformation out there. So, back in the 70s, I'm old enough to remember the 70s, and like, there was all kinds of oh, it's going to kill our economy to clean our water and clean our air and protect endangered species. And it didn't. Companies actually found that by doing, for example, pollution capture technologies and other things, they actually saved money. So I think that there are a lot of ways that we can do that. And I can go on more. I think we need to get rid of monocultures. We need to stop subsidizing, especially wheat and corn, through the farm bill, so that we can start promoting more sustainable agriculture, because nobody seems to be really talking about this, but we're at risk of losing our topsoil, which may seem like, oh, who cares? But we need topsoil to grow food, right? It's a big deal. Not a lot of people talking about that. It's because we have these huge monocultures. So we're not farming in sustainable ways where you have crop rotation and other things. And also, we need to work with foreign governments, like Bolsonaro in Brazil has lifted restrictions on cutting down the rainforest. And the rainforest is a huge carbon sink. We suck out a lot of carbon through that. And we need to worry so many things. I could go on and on, but for instance, I read a statistic that said there's an area the size of Great Britain that gets paved over. It gets put under concrete every single year. So we need to be we need to be working with our land managers and our urban planners to try and reduce sprawl and try and get more infill. So there's a lot of ways that we can tackle environmental sustainability. And it's like I said, it's complex, but it's doable. It's just a matter of taking the time to do it.
You touched on this a little bit earlier. How can you ensure bipartisanship while implementing climate legislation?
Yeah, that's tricky because of course, no one can control anyone else's behavior. All I could do and all I have done, and I have done it successfully. As it happens, I'm a trained facilitator as well, um, because what I've done in the past is found the common ground, right? So for example, when we were trying to set up weed management areas, so for those who don't know, um, invasive plants are a huge issue, right? And an invasive plant is a plant normally brought in from somewhere else that doesn't have any natural controls. And so it spreads like crazy, and it devastates areas so that it kills the native plants. And of course, then, that impacts the animals that need to eat the plants. It impacts the pollinators. It's a huge thing. And so you have something like cheatgrass out west, which then becomes highly flammable and exacerbates fire and all these other things. So we wanted to set up weed management areas where we were working collaboratively. So you didn't have one federal agency planting ice plant. The Department of Transportation was planting ice plant in California while, the DOD was trying to rip it all out. And we were working at cross purposes. So we got together and we brought together farmers and land managers and federal agencies and state agencies and all the rest. And we all had different motives, right? Because nobody wanted the same thing out of the land, right? We all wanted different things, but we all could find common ground by looking at the issue of invasiveness specifically and collaborating. And I think that in Congress, that gets lost sometime. Every representative is supposed to represent the people's interests. Now, those interests may be different in Washington state than they are in Louisiana or Maine or wherever. But ultimately, everybody wants things like an education, a high quality education for their kids. Everyone wants clean air and water. Everyone wants to be able to feed their families. So if you look at those areas where we can find common purpose and stop worrying about political whatever and who's saying what and doing what, and just focus on what the outcomes we all want to achieve are, that's the first step towards building bipartisanship, right? That's the first step towards bringing people together to work together. Because I'll tell you what, working at DOD, I worked at DOD for 22 years, and I got to tell you, that's a diverse group of people, right? There's a lot of diversity there, and we were able to achieve a great deal simply by finding those areas where we all wanted to see some progress.
And kind of going off of that, what will you do to ensure that vulnerable communities are protected during the transition to clean energy, especially in the Green New Deal?
Right. So you mean in terms of provide, well, I personally support UBI. I'm a fan of giving people some sort of universal basic income to try and help them transition through places. There have been a number of studies done in Chelsea and in California, I can't remember the town, where they actually provided a UBI, universal basic income for folks, Stockton, California. And they were able to, and they looked at what was the result. Did everybody take that money and basically sit around and do nothing? No. It turned out to be the exact opposite, right? People spent a lot of the money on necessities, on food and clothing and whatever. And many people were able to then stop working in these multiple part-time jobs, doing whatever, and were able to find career jobs where they could get a good living wage and find something that was personally fulfilling to do on a professional basis. There was very little down, right? It was almost all positive. So far, all the UBI experiments have been very positive. So in terms of transitioning people, you've got to obviously provide training and, resources, but I think providing a UBI would be incredibly helpful to help people transition through to getting a good high-paying job. And also, I mean, of course, I'm a full supporter of a living wage. In Virginia, this is going a little off topic, but in Virginia, our minimum wage was just raised to $9.50 an hour from $7.25 on May 1st. And I got to tell you, in this district, you cannot live on $9.50 an hour unless you're working 2 full-time jobs. So that's a little off topic, but that would be what I would do.
And what are your thoughts on the intersection of climate policy and foreign policy?
Well, so here, that's a great question, right? Because so many people think of climate change as this local thing, right? And it's the reality is, and this is why I get upset with the incremental approach, the net zero by 2050, right? Because the halfway point between the right side and the wrong side is still the wrong side, because an incremental approach to climate change means a net zero approach means that you're basically squeezing the balloon. You're saying, okay, we're not going to have that pollution here, but we're just going to go and let it have, we're going to let it happen over somewhere else. Probably a less economically advantaged country. The problem is that we all live in one planet. It's one home, right? People need to expand their thinking. And the reality is you can't tackle climate. You have to tackle climate at all the levels, right? Each one of us individually needs to take responsibility. And I can talk more about that. And then our government needs to work nationally to implement things. And we have to work internationally because, for example, I've heard a lot of people complaining, why should the US cut its climate emissions when China is increasing theirs? Without an understanding that 50% of what China produces is for the US. That means 50% of their emissions are actually the US's responsibility. Climate change is a global issue, and we have to work with other countries, and we have to do it by providing, we have to provide aid, and we have to provide technology, right? Most of the problems in countries that are suffering with climate impacts, which are, drought, floods, storms, insects, pests, viruses. I mean, all these things are exacerbated by this wonky situation that's happening with our climate because of the weather weirding, right? That's what I call it, the weather weird. Like, weather is short term, it's days, months, a couple of years, and climate is decades and centuries. And the biggest thing in terms of the intersection between US public policy and foreign relations is that right now we are not incorporating climate into every single foreign relations discussion that we're having. And the reality is that climate change is an intersectional issue that underlies every other major issue that the world is facing right now. Famines, floods, conflict. I mean, there are wars being fought over natural resources, over clean water, right? And so I think that is the biggest change we need to make in terms of our foreign policy, is to make sure that we are incorporating a holistic view when we deal with other nations.
And our next question is, would you incentivize individuals and the private sector to increase energy efficiency? And if so, how?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. I think you do have to incentivize them, because if you don't have an incentive, why would you bother making a change, right? So there was a big push a few years back when we were first trying to, sort of pre-Trump, when we were trying to get to a more energy efficient stage where there was rebates on energy efficient windows, and you could get major coupons for getting LED lights and that kind of thing. And you want to incentivize good behavior, right? We incentivize all kinds of good behavior. If you don't smoke, you get a discount on your health insurance or whatever it is. Although personally, I think we need free health insurance. But and that was true in the 70s as well. There was incentives for companies to develop new technologies for alternative energies, for solar panels, for biofuels, for all these things to try and make them more efficient. And what's really sad, you probably don't know this, but the very first thing Ronald Reagan did when he came into office was to rip out the solar panels on the White House that President Carter had put in. And just think where we would be now on an energy and climate stage if we'd had 40 years of technology development and not oil and gas industry really just making things worse all over the place.
And how will you protect the rights of Indigenous peoples who have been disproportionately affected by climate change?
Yeah, the environmental justice is a huge part of the Green New Deal. It's also why we have to be careful of projects like the XL pipeline, which goes right through Indigenous lands. This country has a horrific history of mistreating Indigenous peoples. And I think that we're hopefully going to turn the corner now that we have Deb Haaland at Interior. I'm really excited about that. And I'm hoping to see a real change. And, you know, I go back to what I said at the beginning of our chat. You have to invite all stakeholders. You have to invite all affected parties. And if you're talking about anything to do with the environment, you have to invite Indigenous peoples to make sure that they are part of the discussion, just like you have to invite people who are impacted, like is it Mississippi that had the water issue, where the people at the end of the water pipeline were in the least, you know, primarily black and brown communities that were the least economically advantaged groups. And you have to invite people who are going to be affected to make sure that things are implemented in an equitable way, right? Because otherwise it's all a NIMBY, right? Not in my backyard, but it's got to go somewhere, and we need to find, you know, there are plenty of places where there are not people living where we can set up industrialized areas for what we need.
And continuing off of that, many lower income workers face substantial risks to health and safety in the workplace, especially. What measures would you propose to create healthier workplaces?
Yeah, excellent. So that's something that is, I think, huge. I think it's appalling that people have been forced to work when they haven't had to when they haven't been able to take the precautions, right? Virginia is a right to work state. So workers' rights is huge here, right? I mentioned the minimum wage still being $9.50. And so just to put that in perspective, in our district, a 1-bedroom garden apartment is going to run you anywhere from $1,500 to $1,800. And if you're making, you know, even $15 an hour, you're barely scraping, you're barely getting by. In addition to which, we are dead last in workers' rights. We're 51st out of 51, if you include the District of Columbia, in the nation for workers' rights. And that's because there's no collective bargaining, and there's no paid medical leave, and there's no childcare for working families. And, you know, I could probably go on or look it up, but we need to make sure that we have a living wage. We need to make sure that workers have collective bargaining rights. We need to make sure that we're passing things like childcare for working families, like Schedules That Work Act, so that we can empower our workers. You know, the weird thing is, and I'm going to keep doing this, and because I'm you know, I'm over 50, but Henry Ford literally created the middle class, right? So we have a worse wealth divide than at any point since before Ford. There used to be terrible income inequality, terrible workers' rights in this country, right? With the robber barons and the railroads and all that stuff. And Henry Ford said, you know what? I need to make sure that the people who work for me can buy my product. That was his thing, right? I'm going to get wealthy and have a successful business because everybody's going to be able to afford my product. And we need to get back to that mentality. We need businesses to be able to provide working environments and pay, equitable pay, that enables them to buy the products for the companies they're working for. So I think those are the things that if I were in office, I would do at the federal level.
And to move on to the scientific community, science can be a powerful ally in the environmental debate. How can the scientific community be made more accountable to the public?
How can the scientific community be made more accountable to the public? So I'm not really sure I understand what you mean. I mean, science needs to operate outside of government intervention or public pressure. Science needs to be pure and they need to be focused on the facts. I would say government needs to allow science to be released. There's a lot of, certainly in the Trump administration, there was a lot of suppression of scientific data. And I don't think that it's the scientific community itself that's actually preventing the information from getting out. I think that that's political forces. It's people in charge of agencies, which are, you know, political appointees, who are suppressing some of that. And I've worked with a lot of scientists, and I think that what we could do to try and increase the ability of scientists to get their message out is to give them more autonomy, right? Instead of having a gatekeeper who might be a political appointee with, you know, whatever their political bent is, let the scientists from the agencies put out their information without having to go through the gatekeeper of a political appointee. And I think then you would see more scientific data coming out. Does
And
that help?
yeah, that makes sense. And for our final question, we want to know how you will reach out to your community and also include diverse perspectives in your policymaking.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks for that. So we actually are having our first campaign field kickoff event on June 12th. As you probably know, Virginia has a gubernatorial election, which has a primary June 8th. So we're trying to be very respectful of that right now. And we are working to support some of our fellow candidates. We've actually been helping canvass for a House delegate last weekend and this weekend. And trying not to do too much in terms of our actual ground game with the community until after the June 8th, because it's confusing to people, right? Are you running now? Are you running later? But come June 9th, we're hitting it. June 12th is our big kickoff event. And we plan to canvass. I'm going to try and hit as many, knock as many doors as possible. Our intent is to really reach out to young people, especially new voters, to women, to single parents, and to immigrant communities, because those are the communities that are actually not being served by our current representative. He's doing a great job for the more affluent white male, but for everybody else, there's, they need a voice. In terms of diversity, we have a diverse community. We have a diverse campaign. I'm running to represent all peoples. I'm running because everyone needs a voice. So I'm not really sure how else to include diversity other than we have diverse people and we're reaching out to diverse communities, because really everyone needs a voice, right? Every single person should be represented by their representative, not just some sliver of the district. And that's one of the biggest reasons I'm running, is because I don't think that's happening. That, and I also disagree on a policy basis with some of the significant policies like universal health care, universal child care for working families, and aggressive climate action are some of the big ones. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much for stopping by. We'll be sure to reach out to see how we can help the campaign. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Please go to our website, allieforcongress.com. Follow us on Twitter, Allie4Congress. I'm so excited to have been here, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. It was so nice
All
to meet
right. Thank you.
you. All right. Bye.
Bye.